Hey guys, tonight we're going to step back in time, all the way back to the dawn of the 20th century, to a world teetering on the edge of unimaginable change. Close your eyes for a moment, if you like, and imagine a crisp autumn evening in Europe. The kind where the air smells faintly of wood smoke and damp earth. You're bundled up, maybe with a thick wool blanket, and the world outside your window feels quaint. Edwardian lamps cast soft glows on cobblestone streets, horses clip-clop by, and the latest news, arriving by newspaper, feels far removed from your quiet existence. It's a time of optimism, of grand technological marvels like motor cars and phonographs, of empires stretching across the globe, seemingly unshakable. But beneath that serene surface, a different kind of machine is humming, quietly at first, then building to a terrifying crescendo. We're talking about the First World War, an event so cataclysmic it would redefine warfare, redraw maps, and reshape the human spirit in ways we're still grappling with today. It's a story of mud, blood, and a mechanical, unrelenting grind that devoured millions. You'll likely experience more discomfort just thinking about it tonight than anyone did in those early, naive days of the war. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're standing on a precipice, though you don't quite realize it yet. The year is 1914. Europe is a mosaic of empires, each with its own intricate history, its own simmering resentments, its own grand ambitions. You see the Austro-Hungarian Empire, vast and multi-ethnic, like an old, overstuffed armchair creaking under the weight of its own diversity. To its west, the formidable German Empire, a relatively young but powerful nation, bursting with industrial might and a potent sense of destiny. Eastward lies the sprawling Russian Empire, an enigma of immense landmass and even vaster peasant populations, ruled by a Tsar clinging to an autocratic past. And across the English Channel, Great Britain, the global superpower, its navy ruling the waves, its empire painted red across world maps. France, too, is a player, still smarting from its defeat in the Franco-Prussian War decades earlier, holding a quiet, simmering desire for revenge and the return of Alsace-Lorraine. It's like a giant, meticulously crafted clockwork mechanism, each gear interlocking with another, each spring coiled tight. The alliances are the greased cogs, the triple entente binding France, Russia, and Great Britain, the central powers uniting Germany and Austria-Hungary, with Italy nominally part of their pact. Though historians still debate how committed they truly were from the outset, you might think, looking back, that such a complex system would be robust, resilient. Instead, it was brittle, a house of cards built on mutual suspicion and an almost obsessive need for national honor. Then, on a warm summer day, June 28, 1914, in a place you might never have heard of before this moment, Sarajevo, the capital of Bosnia-Herzegovina, then part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a spark ignites. You hear the crack of a pistol. Gavrilo Princip, a young Serbian nationalist, assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand, heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne, and his wife Sophie. It's a tragedy, certainly, but hardly the first assassination of a royal. In your world today, it would be a major news headline, maybe even a trending topic for a few days. Then it would fade. But in that tightly wound clockwork of 1914, it was the grain of sand that jammed the gears. Austria-Hungary, seeing this as an opportunity to finally crush Serbian nationalism, issues a harsh ultimatum to Serbia. Belgrade, feeling the heat, tries to concede most points but balks at some. Vienna, backed by Berlin, declares war on Serbia. You can almost hear the dominoes begin to fall. Russia, seeing itself as the protector of Slavic peoples, mobilizes its army in support of Serbia. Germany, viewing Russian mobilization as a direct threat, demands Russia demobilize. When Russia refuses, Germany declares war on Russia on August 1st, then swiftly on France, Russia's ally, on August 3rd. You might pause here, confused. Why France? The Germans had a plan, you see, a meticulously drawn blueprint called the Schlieffen Plan, designed by a long-dead field marshal. The idea was to avoid a war on to France, fighting both France in the west and Russia in the east simultaneously. So the plan was to deliver a knockout blow to France first, rapidly, before the lumbering Russian army could fully mobilize. To do this, they decided to march straight through neutral Belgium, bypassing the heavily fortified Franco-German border. You feel a ripple of dread as the German armies pour into Belgium on August 4th, violating its neutrality. This act, perhaps more than any other, pulls Great Britain into the conflict. Britain had guaranteed Belgium's neutrality, and though some historians still argue about the precise motivations, whether it was about Belgian sovereignty or more about preventing German dominance of the European continent, the result was the same. Britain declares war on Germany, and just like that, you are in a world war. It happens so quickly, you barely have time to register the shift. One moment, Europe is seemingly at peace. The next, it's plunged into a global conflict. What's striking is the initial mood. You see young men, your age, even younger, lining up at recruiting stations, singing patriotic songs, brimming with an almost unbelievable optimism. They genuinely believe it will all be over by Christmas. Imagine that for a moment. I'll be home by Christmas, they chant, picturing a quick, glorious victory. Perhaps a dashing cavalry charge or a heroic bayonet assault. They're dreaming of adventure, of glory, of proving themselves. You almost want to grab them by the shoulders and shake them, whisper about the horrors to come, the sheer, unimaginable scale of industrial slaughter that awaits them. But you can't, because this isn't the Napoleonic Wars. This isn't your grandfather's war of muskets and formations. The war machine, remember, it's been quietly evolving. You see the fruits of the Industrial Revolution now. The machine gun, capable of firing hundreds of rounds a minute, turning charging infantry into mere targets. Enormous artillery pieces, firing shells that explode with earth-shattering force, tearing apart flesh and earth alike. Barbed wire, a seemingly innocuous invention, now deployed in vast, tangled webs, designed to funnel men into the killing zones of the machine guns. These aren't just minor improvements. They are fundamentally changing the nature of battle. The Germans push through Belgium, moving with terrifying speed. Their army's a well-oiled machine. You hear tales of their efficiency, their discipline. The French and British Expeditionary Force (BEF) rush to meet them, but they're often outmaneuvered, pushed back in a series of desperate fighting retreats. The air is thick with the smell of Kadite, the screams of the wounded, and the frantic orders of officers trying to stem the tide. Cities fall, towns are occupied, and you see the first streams of refugees. A heartbreaking sight that will become tragically familiar over the next 4 years. You might think, looking at a map, that Paris is doomed. The German advance comes within miles of the French capital. The French government even evacuates to Bordeaux. But then, a moment of extraordinary defiance, a surge of desperate heroism. It's the Battle of the Marne in early September 1914. The French, with crucial support from the British, launch a counterattack. Paris taxis are even famously pressed into service to rush reinforcements to the front. Though historians now debate how significant their actual impact was beyond the morale boost. Regardless, the German advance falters, then finally grinds to a halt. The Schlieffen Plan, that grand, ambitious gamble, has failed. The dream of a swift victory in the West evaporates. Now, you witness something unprecedented. Both sides, realizing they can't simply outflank each other, begin what's known as the race to the sea. Each army tries to extend its lines northward, attempting to get around the enemy's flank, to find an open door to victory. But every time one side extends, the other mirrors it. It's like two giants endlessly trying to punch each other, only to find their fists blocked. Eventually, they reach the English Channel, and there's no more flank to turn. And that's when it happens. The digging begins. You see soldiers, exhausted, facing relentless artillery fire and machine gun fusillades, digging shallow scrapes in the earth for protection. Then, those scrapes become deeper, connected by communication trenches. Soon, you are immersed in a landscape of ditches. You are standing in a trench now, perhaps one in the chalky soil of the Somme, or the muddy clay of Flanders. The earth is constantly being churned by shells, the air thick with the smell of wet earth, stale sweat, unwashed bodies, disinfectant, and something else, something metallic and sickly sweet that you soon learn is the smell of decay. This is trench warfare. This is the new reality. It wasn't a planned strategy. It evolved out of a desperate need for survival against the overwhelming firepower of modern weaponry. You are no longer marching gloriously across open fields. You are living underground, peering over a parapet at a desolate, moonlight landscape known as No Man's Land, a churned-up, barbed wire-strewn wasteland where few dare to tread. Life here is a constant sensory assault. The omnipresent mud, sometimes ankle-deep, sometimes waist-deep, sucking at your boots, seeping into your clothes, clinging to everything. The damp cold that chills you to the bone, even in summer, especially at night. The distant, continuous rumble of artillery, a low growl that becomes the heartbeat of your new existence, punctuated by the sharper crack of rifle fire and the chilling asterisk thump dash thump asterisk of a machine gun. And the silence, when it occasionally falls, is even more unnerving, making you instinctively tense, listening for the telltale whistle of an incoming shell or the quiet rustle of an enemy patrol. Your days become a monotonous cycle of survival. Stand to at dawn and dusk, when everyone is on high alert for an enemy attack, eating your bland rations, usually bully beef and hard-tack biscuits, mending the trench, shoring up crumbling walls, constantly bailing out water, fighting off rats, fat and fearless, who grow to alarming sizes, feasting on refuse, and worse. You might spend hours delousing your uniform, picking through seams for the tenacious, biting lice that infest everyone. Boredom is a constant companion, interspersed with moments of extreme, paralyzing fear. You write letters home, often censored, full of forced cheerfulness, trying to shield your loved ones from the grim reality. The early optimism, the songs, the belief in a quick victory, it shatters quickly against this brutal, static reality. Attacks become suicidal. Over the top is the cry, and you scramble out of the relative safety of your trench, trudging through the mud, tripping on barbed wire, straight into the lethal hail of machine gun fire. Wave after wave of men are cut down, often before they even reach the enemy's front line. The sheer scale of casualties is unprecedented, shocking. Commanders, still operating with tactics developed for a different kind of war, keep ordering these futile charges, convinced that sheer willpower and numerical superiority will eventually break the enemy. They rarely do. This is the beginning of what would become the Western Front, a line of trenches stretching some 475 miles from the North Sea coast of Belgium through France, all the way to the Swiss border. It would barely move for long, agonizing years. Historians still debate whether this stalemate was inevitable, given the defensive power of new weapons, or if it was the result of rigid military doctrine and a lack of innovative thinking. Perhaps it was a bit of both, a horrifying synergy of new technology and old ideas. But even amidst this grinding horror, moments of unexpected humanity could pierce through. You might hear whispers of it, tales passed along the lines. In December 1914, just a few months into the war, something truly extraordinary happened along parts of the front. On Christmas Eve, carols drifted from the German trenches. Then, British soldiers responded. Soon, in some areas, men from opposing sides ventured into no man's land, shook hands, exchanged small gifts, cigarettes, chocolate, buttons from uniforms, and even played impromptu games of football. Imagine that, a fragile, fleeting truce born of a shared humanity and the profound exhaustion of the fighting. It was quickly suppressed by high command, of course, because such moments threatened the very foundations of the war machine, the idea of an irreconcilable enemy. But for a few hours, the war stopped, and men remembered they were just men. The war machine, however, had just begun to warm up. Its gears were truly beginning to turn, grinding up lives and innocence at an astonishing rate. And what started as a seemingly localized conflict was already spreading, drawing in nations from across the globe, reaching out to distant shores and forgotten corners of empires. You've just witnessed the start of something terrible, something that would soon lead to the grim. Iconic battles that would define this conflict. Battles like Verdun and Gallipoli. But those, my friend, are stories for another time. For when the grinding gears of this initial phase have fully settled into their relentless, bloody rhythm, the war machine, however, had just begun to warm up. Its gears were truly beginning to turn, grinding up lives and innocence at an astonishing rate. And what started as a seemingly localized conflict was already spreading, drawing in nations from across the globe, reaching out to distant shores and forgotten corners of empires. You've just witnessed the start of something terrible, something that would soon lead to the grim, iconic battles that would define this conflict. Battles like Verdun and Gallipoli. But those, my friend, are stories for another time. For when the grinding gears of this initial phase have fully settled into their relentless, bloody rhythm, well, guess what? Those gears are now fully engaged. The dream of a quick, glorious dash to victory, that quaint notion of home by Christmas, has vanished like smoke from a doused candle. It's now 1915, and the Western Front is a festering wound, a static scar across the face of Europe. The generals, bewildered by this new reality, still clung to the idea of a breakthrough. They'd pore over maps in their comfortable chateau far behind the lines, tracing lines with their fingers, convinced that just one more push, one more massive bombardment, one more charge would finally crack the enemy's defenses. And you, down in the mud, you're the one doing the pushing. Life in the trenches has calcified into a nightmarish routine. You're not just surviving, you're enduring. The weather, which seemed like a minor inconvenience in 1914, now feels like an active enemy. Winter brings icy winds that bite through your thin uniform, turning the mud into a frozen, treacherous mire. Your breath hangs in the air like a ghost. Spring thaws bring a fresh hell of waterlogged trenches, collapsing dugouts, and the ever-present stench of decaying matter amplified by the rising temperatures. Flies, buzzing with malevolent intent, become your constant companions in the summer, landing on your food, your face, everything. And always, always, the rats. They're bigger now, bolder, scurrying over your sleeping form, their beady eyes glinting in the gloom. You try to tell yourself it's just part of the job, but sometimes, late at night, the sheer absurdity of it all, the endless, meaningless suffering, makes you want to scream. But you don't. You just keep digging, keep watching, keep waiting. In April 1915, near Ypres, in Belgium, you witness another grim innovation courtesy of the war machine. The air, already thick with the smell of death and damp earth, suddenly carries a new, sickly sweet, yet acrid scent like pineapple and pepper, then chlorine. You see a yellowish-green cloud, low to the ground, drifting slowly but inexorably towards your lines, pushed by a prevailing breeze. It's poison gas. The Germans, in a desperate attempt to break the stalemate, have unleashed chlorine gas from thousands of cylinders. The effect is horrifying. Men gasp, their lungs burning, their eyes streaming, their skin blistering. Some collapse, choking, vomiting, their faces turning blue as their respiratory systems fail. Panic rips through the ranks. Those who can flee in terror, blindly trying to outrun the invisible killer. It's not a weapon designed to kill efficiently in a military sense. It's designed to terrorize, to incapacitate, to cause agony. You see the immediate aftermath. Men writhing on the ground, spitting up frothy liquid, their faces contorted in agony. It's a new kind of brutal, intimate horror. Your commanders, initially caught off guard, soon issue rudimentary gas masks, usually just pads of cloth soaked in urine, which contains ammonia, a mild neutralizer, but hardly effective. Later, more sophisticated masks appear, but the psychological impact of gas attacks, the fear of an invisible, agonizing death, lingers. Historians still argue about the true tactical effectiveness of gas in the long run. It rarely achieved a decisive breakthrough, but it certainly added another layer of misery and fear to an already unbearable existence. Meanwhile, far from the muddy, choked battlefields of the Western Front, the war machine is expanding its reach. Remember that vast Ottoman Empire? The one that stretched across parts of the Middle East, North Africa, and Southeast Europe? Well, in late 1914, it officially throws its lot in with the Central Powers, pushed by German influence and a healthy fear of its old adversary, Russia. This changes everything. Suddenly, new theaters of war open up, far from the trenches of France. And this, my friend, is where a certain ambitious First Lord of the Admiralty, a fellow by the name of Winston Churchill, enters the picture. He, along with others, was growing increasingly frustrated by the stalemate on the Western Front. Why bash our heads against a brick wall? They wondered. Why not find a softer spot, a soft underbelly, to punch through? Their eyes turned to the Dardanelles, a narrow strait in Turkey that was the gateway to Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, the Ottoman capital, and crucially, a warm water route to Russia through the Black Sea. The idea was seductive in its simplicity. Use the mighty British and French Navy to force open the Dardanelles sail right up to Constantinople, knock the Ottoman Empire out of the war, relieve pressure on Russia, and potentially open up a new front that would outflank the Central Powers. It sounded like a brilliant strategic masterstroke, a way to bypass the Western Front's grinding horror. Except, history often has a cruel sense of irony. The Dardanelles were not, in fact, a soft underbelly. They were heavily fortified, bristling with German-supplied artillery and Turkish minefields. The initial naval attempts to force the strait in February and March 1915 were a disaster. Battleships were sunk or damaged, and it became clear that land forces would be needed to silence the Turkish guns guarding the Narrows. So in April 1915, you find yourself on a troop transport, not headed for the cold, damp trenches of France, but for the sunny, seemingly exotic shores of the Gallipoli Peninsula. You're among a motley collection of troops, British regulars, French colonial soldiers, and crucially, the ANZACs, the Australian and New Zealand Army Corps. These are young men from distant lands, full of eager patriotism, perhaps a little naive, but tough as nails. They've traveled halfway across the world to fight for an empire many of them had only read about. The landings on April 25, 1915, are chaos personified. Imagine trying to disembark from small boats onto narrow beaches, under intense machine gun and rifle fire from well-dug-in Turkish defenders, who happen to be excellent shots, and are led by an extraordinarily capable officer named Mustafa Kemal the Future Ataturk, founder of modern Turkey. You scramble ashore, bullets whizzing past your head, comrades falling around you. The beaches turn red with blood, Instead of a swift, decisive breakthrough, you find yourself immediately pinned down, scrabbling for cover on steep, unforgiving hillsides. The terrain is brutal. It's rugged, rocky, covered in thorny scrub. The heat is oppressive, the sun beating down mercilessly. Water is scarce, and just like on the Western Front, the digging begins. But here, the trenches are often shallow, hastily constructed, sometimes little more than scrapes in the hard ground. The stalemate descends with terrifying speed. You're fighting for mere meters of ground, sometimes for a single observation post on a ridge. The sensory details are different from the Western Front, but no less horrifying. Instead of mud, you have dust that gets into everything, coating your throat, your food, your eyes. The constant drone of flies is replaced by the incessant buzzing of giant, green blowflies, drawn to the bodies that lie unburied in no man's land, too dangerous to retrieve. The air isn't thick with the smell of decay from cold, damp earth, but from the hot, baking sun. A truly sickening aroma. Dysentery and other diseases spread like wildfire through the cramped, unsanitary trenches. Waterborne illnesses become as deadly as enemy bullets. Men are evacuated not just for wounds, but for chronic diarrhea and debilitating fevers. You spend your days swatting flies, rationing water, and listening to the rhythmic crackle of distant rifle fire, and the occasional burst of machine gun chatter, punctuated by the dull thud of mortar shells. Months drag on. August brings a massive offensive, an attempt to break the deadlock at places like Chunuk Bair and Suvla Bay. Again, brave men charge. Again, they are cut down. The Turks, defending their homeland, fight with incredible tenacity. The leadership on the Allied side is often, well, let's just say less than stellar. Orders are confused, communications break down, reinforcements arrive too late or not at all. It's a logistical nightmare played out on a grand scale, a testament to how asterisk not asterisk to run a military campaign. The casualties mount, thousands upon thousands. The Anzacs, in particular, earn a reputation for incredible courage and endurance, forging a national identity in the crucible of this terrible, futile campaign. But courage alone can't win against impossible odds and entrenched defenses. By December 1915 and January 1916, after months of fighting, suffering, and little to no strategic gain, the Allied High Command finally accepts defeat. The decision is made to evacuate. Remarkably, the evacuation itself is perhaps the most successful part of the entire campaign. Carried out with minimal loss of life, a testament to meticulous planning and a bit of luck. But the cost was immense. Over 250,000 Allied casualties, including nearly 45,000 dead, and around 250,000 Turkish casualties, including an estimated 87,000 dead. Gallipoli, initially conceived as a brilliant shortcut to victory, became yet another monument to the war machine's insatiable appetite. It was a grand strategic gamble that failed spectacularly, proving that even a soft underbelly could turn out to be armored with surprising resilience. While Gallipoli was unfolding in the searing heat of Turkey, the Western Front continued its grim, attritional dance. By late 1915, the French, in particular, were feeling the strain. They had borne the brunt of the German attacks and their army had suffered staggering losses. Their spirit, though still resilient, was being slowly eroded by the constant, grinding horror. General Erich von Falkenhayn, the chief of the German General Staff, looked at this situation and saw an opportunity, not for a breakthrough, not for a swift victory, but for something far more cynical, far more brutal. His plan was simple, yet chillingly effective. Bleed France white. He chose a target, Verdun. Now, Verdun wasn't just any town. It was a powerful symbol, an ancient fortified city in northeastern France, a historical bastion against German invasion for centuries. Its surrounding hills were bristling with forts and redoubts thought to be impregnable. Falkenhayn reasoned that the French would defend Verdun to the last man, no matter the cost, because of its strategic and symbolic importance, by relentlessly attacking it by creating a mincing machine. He wouldn't aim to capture the city itself, but to force the French to pour every available man and resource into its defense, bleeding them dry in the process until their army simply disintegrated. It was warfare reduced to its most brutal, dehumanizing essence, attrition, pure and simple, sacrificing your own men to kill more of the enemy. On February 21st, 1916, you are there, on the French side of the line, facing the inferno. The morning is cold, misty. Then, at 7:15 a.m., the world ends. A deafening roar tears through the air. Thousands upon thousands of German artillery pieces, from massive 420mm Big Berthas to smaller field guns, open fire simultaneously on a front of just 15 miles. It's not just a bombardment, it's an annihilation. Shells rain down, tearing apart the earth, pulverizing trees into splinters, vaporizing trenches, turning men into unrecognizable pulp. The noise is beyond comprehension, a continuous, apocalyptic thunder that shakes the very ground beneath your feet, vibrating in your bones. You feel the concussive force of near misses, the earth erupting around you, showering you with dirt and shrapnel. The German artillery barrages last for 9 hours on that first day, an unprecedented level of firepower. It's designed not just to kill, but to terrorize, to shatter morale, to reduce the battlefield to a lunar landscape of craters and chaos. You huddle in a dugout, if you're lucky enough to have one that hasn't collapsed, praying the next shell doesn't have your name on it. The air is thick with smoke, dust, and the acrid smell of high explosives. When the barrage finally lifts, an eerie, ringing silence descends, broken only by the screams of the wounded. Then the German infantry advance. They walk, not run, through the devastated landscape, expecting to find no one left alive. And for many sectors, they're right. The initial French defenses are simply wiped off the map. For Douaumont, one of the key French strongholds, falls almost absurdly easily, captured by a small German patrol simply walking into it, finding it deserted. This initial success is alarming, threatening a complete French collapse. But the French, though battered, refuse to break. General Philippe Pétain is famously put in command, and he issues the legendary order, "They shall not pass." He understands the unique challenge of Verdun. This isn't about grand strategic maneuvers. It's about sheer, bloody-minded endurance. He implements a system of constant troop rotation, the asterisk Noria asterisk system, named after a water wheel. Units are sent into the meat grinder for a few weeks, then pulled out, rested, and replaced by fresh units. This means that an astonishing 70% of the entire French army would eventually pass through Verdun. Experiencing its horrors directly, it spreads the burden, but also ensures that the psychological scars of Verdun would be seared into the very soul of the French nation. Your days in Verdun become an endless cycle of fighting in pulverized, moonlight landscapes. You stumble through a labyrinth of shell craters, the ground a churned, viscous mud, often littered with body parts. Communication trenches are obliterated, meaning you often have to cross open ground under enemy fire. Your objective isn't glory, it's survival, and holding onto a few yards of ground. Every meter is fought for, lost, then fought for again. The fighting is close quarters, brutal, often hand to hand, with bayonets, trench knives, and even shovels. The logistical lifeline for the French army is a single, narrow road, later dubbed the asterisk voie sacrée asterisk, the sacred way. Imagine a constant, unending convoy of trucks, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, bringing up men, ammunition, food, water, and taking back the wounded and the dead. Without it, Verdun would have fallen. It is a testament to the sheer scale of effort required to sustain this new kind of industrial warfare. Verdun becomes the longest battle of the war, lasting over 300 days, from February to December 1916. It is a battle of attrition, just as Falkenhayn intended, but it bleeds both sides white. The Germans, too, pay a terrible price. The landscape becomes literally uninhabitable, a place of unburied dead, poisoned ground, and perpetual shell fire. You walk over ground where the earth itself is composed of human remains and shattered ordnance. The forest of Verdun, once dense and ancient, is reduced to splintered stumps and a few ghostly, twisted trees. Historians still dissect Verdun. Was it truly a strategic victory for either side, or just an unspeakable tragedy of waste? The French held, but at what cost? The Germans failed to bleed France white to the point of collapse, but they certainly inflicted immense suffering. The war machine, indifferent to the suffering of individuals, simply chewed through divisions, disgorging them as mangled, shell-shocked survivors or forgotten corpses. From the sun-baked, dusty hills of Gallipoli to the mud-soaked, shell-blasted ruins of Verdun, the pattern is clear. The grand strategic gambles, the attempts at clever flanking maneuvers, the desire for a swift, decisive victory, all consistently failed against the power of modern defensive weaponry and the tenacity of men fighting for their lives. The war had settled into its grim, relentless rhythm. It was a war of material, of industry, of human bodies thrown into a colossal grinding machine. And the machine was hungry. It was always hungry. You can almost hear its ceaseless hum in the background, a low, metallic growl that promises more. More battles, more casualties, more innovations in killing. Because even as Verdun raged, other plans were being laid, other offensives prepared, promising to finally break the stalemate, to finally deliver the knockout blow. But you, now, know better. You know the machine. You know its appetite and its next course. Well, that would be the Somme. But that, my friend, is a story for when the sun has truly set on this harrowing day. Okay, the sun has indeed set. The air is still, perhaps even a little heavy, carrying a faint echo of distant thunder. Though it's just your imagination, Verdun has churned itself into a dark, bloody memory, a testament to pure, unadulterated attrition. But before the dust had even settled there, before the last, exhausted French soldier had been rotated out of that nightmare, the British were making their own plans. Big plans. Plans to finally, break the German lines to end this static hell. And so, you find yourself shifting focus from the pulverized earth of the Meuse to the gentle, rolling countryside of the Somme River Valley in Picardy. This, you're told, is where the decisive blow will land. The British High Command, led by Field Marshal Sir Douglas Haig, was convinced that the Germans were on the verge of collapse, weakened by Verdun. It was time for a big push. The French, still reeling from Verdun, would provide some support. But this was to be primarily a British show. A show of force, a demonstration of their growing industrial might, their massive volunteer army. You hear the chatter, the optimistic forecasts. This time, they say, this time we'll do it. The plan is deceptively simple. Unleash a bombardment of unprecedented scale, so devastating that it would obliterate the German trenches, cut through their barbed wire, and wipe out every last machine gunner. Then the infantry, walking slowly, almost casually, would simply stroll across no man's land and occupy the ruined German positions. No need to run, you see. The wire would be gone. The defenders would be dead. It would be a cakewalk. Imagine the sheer, terrifying confidence of that assumption. It is the kind of thinking that would make a modern-day health and safety officer faint dead away. For weeks leading up to the attack, a colossal logistical effort unfolds around you. Railway lines are laid, roads are built, ammunition dumps swell to monstrous proportions. You see tens of thousands of artillery pieces, small field guns, medium howitzers, enormous naval guns hauled from the coast, being brought into position, their muzzles pointing eastward. Shells, millions of them, are stacked in neat pyramids, waiting to be fed into the hungry mouths of the guns. The air crackles with anticipation, a strange blend of fear and almost childlike hope. The preliminary bombardment begins on June 24, 1916. For 7 straight days and nights, the earth trembles. You can barely hear yourself think. The sky is a constant canvas of flashing lights. The air thick with the smell of cadite and pulverized earth. It's the loudest sound you have ever, or will ever, hear. You are convinced nothing could possibly survive this. Surely, every German trench, every dugout, every strand of barbed wire must be atomized. The commanders back at headquarters, sipping tea in their comfy chateau, are convinced too. But here's the thing about those Germans. They were good at digging, really good. They had spent 2 years perfecting their defensive lines, digging deep, reinforced dugouts, sometimes 30 or 40 feet underground, capable of withstanding the most ferocious bombardments. And those millions of shells? A significant proportion of them were duds, failing to explode. Others simply churned up the ground, creating more craters. but leaving much of the barbed wire intact. And crucially, while the shelling was intense, it wasn't always accurate. Those perfectly positioned machine guns, many were still there, waiting. The morning of July 1st, 1916, dawns misty and cool. At 7:30 a.m., whistles blow along a 25-mile front. You climb out of the trench, your heart pounding, a cold knot of dread in your stomach that no amount of patriotic singing can dislodge. You are part of the first wave, the men who are supposed to walk across no man's land. To your left and right, thousands upon thousands of men emerge simultaneously, carrying heavy packs, some even wearing their entire kit, as if heading for a parade. The initial waves are ordered to advance in straight lines, shoulder to shoulder, maintaining formation. Because that's how you did it in previous wars, right? Because they thought the Germans were gone. The noise is still immense, but it's different now. Your own artillery is still firing, but the roar is punctuated by the terrifying asterisk rat dash a dash tat dash tat asterisk of German machine guns. A sound that quickly becomes the soundtrack to hell. You see the barbed wire, twisted and snarled, but far from obliterated. Men get caught on it, struggling, easy targets. You see the flash of muzzle fire from the German trenches, from the dugouts that were supposed to be destroyed. And you see your comrades, literally by the hundreds, then thousands, falling round you. They crumple to the ground, some screaming, some just collapsing silently, like sacks of potatoes. The ground quickly becomes littered with bodies. It's an absolute, unmitigated catastrophe. The first day of the Somme is the single bloodiest day in the history of the British Army. In just a few hours, they suffer nearly 60,000 casualties, roughly 20,000 dead, 40,000 wounded. Imagine that, almost one casualty every second. The scale is so horrific, it's almost abstract, like trying to comprehend the distance to the moon. But you're right there, tripping over the bodies of your friends, watching waves of hopeful young men dissolve into red mist. The optimism of the high command, the easy talk of breakthroughs, seems like a sick joke. But the Somme doesn't end on July 1st. Oh no, that was just the appetizer. The battle drags on for another 4.5 months, until mid-November. The strategic objective shifts from a grand breakthrough to piecemeal, attritional attacks, fighting for every single crater, every shattered tree stump. You become intimately familiar with the topography of death. The mud, exacerbated by constant shelling and autumn rains, becomes legendary. It's thick, clinging, inescapable, often deep enough to drown in if you slip into a shell hole. Men get stuck, sometimes for hours, until their comrades can pull them out, if they can. The dead are often swallowed by it, disappearing without a trace, their resting places marked only by the shifting, sucking earth. The landscape is beyond recognition. Trees are skeletal, splintered remains. Villages are reduced to rubble and pulverized brick dust. The ground is a lunarscape of interconnected shell craters, some as wide as small houses, forming a treacherous maze. You learn to navigate by the twisted remnants of old trenches or the occasional half-buried boot. The air always carries the metallic tang of blood, the sickly sweet smell of decay, and the acrid smell of high explosive. Rats, fatter and bolder than ever, scurry across the bodies, undisturbed. You become numb to it, or you break. Life on the Somme is a constant, exhausting struggle against the elements and an unseen enemy. You're cold, wet, hungry, perpetually sleep deprived. Your uniform is caked in mud that never seems to dry. The constant barrage of artillery fire is relentless, turning day and night into a continuous nightmare of concussive blasts and whizzing shrapnel. Shell shock, the invisible wound, begins to take a terrible toll. Men simply shut down, unable to speak, trembling uncontrollably, their minds shattered by the ceaseless horror. You might see a body, perfectly fine one moment, suddenly cowering in a corner, weeping uncontrollably at the distant thump of a gun. It's a new kind of injury, one that doctors and commanders struggle to understand, often dismissing it as cowardice. Pull yourself together, man, they'd bark, completely oblivious to the trauma seared into the very souls of their soldiers. But the war machine, ever hungry for new ways to kill, or at least to try to kill more efficiently, also unveils a new toy at the Somme. On September 15th, 1916, you see them for the first time, strange, rhomboid-shaped behemoths, made of steel, rumbling slowly across the broken ground, spitting fire from their flanks. These are tanks, literally. They were called tanks during development to disguise their true purpose. The British invention, a desperate gamble to break the trench stalemate. Their initial debut is mixed, to say the least. Many break down, get stuck in craters, or simply can't keep up with the infantry. Their speed is glacial, their armor isn't entirely impervious, and their crews suffer terribly from heat and fumes inside. Imagine a rattling metal box, filled with noise and carbon monoxide, trundling across a battlefield, and you're inside it, trying to aim a gun. Not exactly a scene from an action movie, but even with their mechanical failings, their psychological impact is considerable. At least initially, the Germans had never seen anything like them. A moving fortress, seemingly impervious to rifle fire, capable of crushing barbed wire. The sight of them can cause panic. However, their numbers are too few, and their deployment to piecemeal, to achieve the decisive breakthrough their inventors had envisioned. They are a promise of the future, a glimpse of how warfare would evolve. But for now, they are just another piece of the terrifying, experimental puzzle. Above you, the air war is also evolving, no longer just for reconnaissance. Flimsy biplanes engage in dogfights. The crackle of their machine guns audible even over the distant artillery. Pilots become the new knights of the sky, their individual duels celebrated in newspapers back home. A stark contrast to the anonymous, muddy slaughter below. You might see a speck in the sky suddenly erupt in flames, spiraling down, a brief, fiery comet. It's a cleaner, faster death, perhaps, than the one on the ground. By the time the battle finally winds down in mid-November, swallowed by the bitter cold and relentless rain, the numbers are truly staggering. The British had advanced a mere 6 miles at their deepest point. The French, about 4. The casualties, over 400,000 British, 200,000 French, and an estimated 450,000 to 500,000 German. Over 1 million men in total, killed or wounded, for a few miles of churned-up mud. It's a testament to the war machine's capacity for consumption, its indifference to human life. It didn't discriminate. It simply consumed. Historians still debate the Somme. Was it a necessary battle to relieve pressure on the French at Verdun? Perhaps. Did it wear down the German army, as Haig later claimed? Certainly, the Germans suffered immensely, losing many of their best pre-war regular soldiers. But at what cost? And did it achieve its stated objective of a breakthrough? Absolutely not. It stands as a grim symbol of the futility of attritional warfare, the stubborn refusal of commanders to adapt tactics to new technologies, and the horrific cost of their mistakes. For many, especially the British, the Somme became synonymous with ultimate sacrifice, unimaginable suffering, and a profound sense of waste. The lost generation wasn't just a poetic phrase, it was a demographic reality. As 1916 grinds to a close, a sense of profound weariness settles over the Western Front. The initial surge of patriotism has long since evaporated, replaced by a grim determination, a bone-deep cynicism, or outright despair. The soldiers, the ones who are left, are no longer the eager young volunteers of 1914. They are hardened, haunted veterans, their eyes holding 1,000 unspeakable horrors. They have seen the worst of humanity and the worst of the war machine. They know that no single battle, no matter how grandly conceived, will end this. They know that this grinding, mechanical slaughter is the new normal. But the machine doesn't care about their feelings. It just keeps turning. It demands more men, more shells, more suffering. And the high commands, still convinced that victory is just one more push away, are already sketching out the next great offensive. They look at the maps, they count the men, they calculate the munitions. They talk about strategic importance and decisive blows. And you, down in the mud, you just try to stay alive, wondering how much more the Earth and you can possibly endure. The war, which once seemed to have a beginning, middle, and end, now feels like an endless, self-perpetuating nightmare, its tendrils reaching out to new continents, new battlefields. And indeed, the war machine's relentless expansion wasn't limited to Europe and the Dardanelles. While Gallipoli and the Somme raged, other, quieter, but no less brutal, conflicts were simmering elsewhere, drawing in more and more players, reshaping the map even further. The vastness of the British and French empires meant that the war wasn't just fought by Europeans. Men from India, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, and various African colonies were fighting in the freezing mud of Flanders or the scorching sun of the Middle East. German colonies, too, were fighting for their survival, or being taken over by Allied forces. It was truly a asterisk world, asterisk war, even if the Western Front remained its bloody, static heart. In Africa, for instance, you find yourself tracking the elusive German colonial forces, led by a brilliant commander named Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck. He's a master of guerrilla warfare, leading his small force of Germans and a scary native African soldiers on a wild goose chase across East Africa for the entire duration of the war. They tie up vast numbers of Allied troops, British, South African, Indian, Belgian, Portuguese, in a grueling campaign through jungles and plains, fighting disease and terrain as much as the enemy. It's a sideshow compared to the Western Front, but for the men involved, It's a brutal, exhausting, and often forgotten war, far from the headlines. Fought under a blazing sun against tenacious foes and deadly tropical diseases. Imagine the sheer tenacity. Running a supply chain for thousands of men through a continent with almost no infrastructure, all while constantly being hunted. It is a logistics expert's worst nightmare, and a testament to one man. As sheer bloody-mindedness. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the British, sensing weakness in the Ottoman Empire, after Gallipoli, begin to eye its territories. The campaign in Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, is a messy, poorly executed affair, initially aimed at protecting oil supplies and British interests in India. You hear tales of British and Indian troops dying more from heat stroke, disease, and starvation than from actual combat, particularly during the disastrous siege of Kut al-Amara, where thousands of British and Indian soldiers surrendered after months of starvation. It's a far cry from the glorification of battle, a stark reminder that even in seemingly minor theaters, the war machine was just as efficient at breaking bodies and spirits. But the most romanticized, if still brutal, campaign in the Middle East involves the Arab Revolt. You might have heard of Lawrence of Arabia, a dashing figure who became almost mythical. The British, ever keen to destabilize the Ottoman Empire, encouraged Arab nationalists, led by figures like Hussein bin Ali, the Sharif of Mecca, to rise up against their Turkish overlords. You see small, mobile columns of Arab irregulars, often accompanied by a handful of British officers like Lawrence, raiding Ottoman railway lines, blowing up bridges, and attacking garrisons in the vast, unforgiving desert. It's a war of movement, of lightning raids and ambushes, a stark contrast to the static horrors of the Western Front. The heat is intense, the sand is everywhere, and survival often depends on your understanding of the desert and its fiercely independent inhabitants. It's a war fought for different stakes, for independence and a new Arab nation, promises that would, of course, be complicated and largely unfulfilled by later political maneuvering, leading to decades of resentment and conflict you're still seeing play out today. History, you see, rarely ties up its loose ends neatly. Back in Europe, away from the mud of the trenches and the dust of the desert, the navies of the great powers are still slugging it out, albeit more cautiously. The Grand Fleet actions that many expected at the start of the war never really materialize, mostly because neither side wants to risk their precious capital ships. But there is one colossal exception: the Battle of Jutland in May 1916. You can almost feel the spray, the concussive blasts, the shuddering of enormous battleships. It's the largest naval battle of the entire war, a clash between the British Grand Fleet and the German High Seas Fleet in the cold, grey waters of the North Sea. Hundreds of ships, thousands of guns, firing at each other across miles of ocean. It's a chaotic, confusing slugfest, fought in poor visibility, punctuated by spectacular explosions as battleships are hit and sink. Both sides claim victory, of course. The Germans sink more British ships, but the British Navy, despite its losses, maintains its numerical superiority and, crucially, its blockade of Germany. The British naval blockade, slowly but surely, begins to strangle the German economy, choking off vital supplies of food and raw materials. It's a less dramatic, but ultimately profoundly significant form of warfare, affecting civilians as much as soldiers, a slow, grinding attrition that complements the one on land. Historians still argue about who won Jutland, but practically, the German fleet largely remained in port for the rest of the war, conceding naval dominance to Britain. And beneath the waves, a silent, terrifying war is raging. Submarines, once a novel invention, are now a deadly weapon. German U-boats, sleek and stealthy, patrol the Atlantic, sinking Allied merchant ships, trying to cut off Britain's lifelines. You see the fear in the eyes of sailors, the constant vigilance, the knowledge that an unseen torpedo could end their voyage and their lives at any moment. The sinking of the Lusitania, a British passenger liner, with American citizens on board in May 1915, caused outrage and pushed America closer to war. Even though the Germans argued it was carrying munitions, which it was incidentally, along with passengers, a truly terrible combination. This unrestricted submarine warfare, with its inherent dangers to neutral shipping, will become a major factor in drawing the United States into the conflict. Because even as the old empires struggled and bled, a new, massive power was watching, waiting, and calculating. As 1917 approaches, the war machine has become a truly global phenomenon, its gears meshing across continents and oceans. It has devoured millions, transformed societies, and reshaped the very concept of warfare. It has shown the world the terrible power of industrialization, when turned to the purpose of destruction. And it is far from finished. The exhausted mud-caked soldiers of the Western Front, the sailors battling the unseen menace below the waves, the colonial troops fighting in distant deserts and jungles. They all await the next turn of the screw, the next grand offensive, the next terrible innovation. They await the year when the stalemate might finally break, or when the world might simply collapse under the weight of its own suffering. But that, my friend, is a story for when the moon is high and the night is deep. But that, my friend, is a story for when the moon is high and the night is deep. And the moon is indeed high now, casting long, fractured shadows across your mental landscape. A landscape perpetually scarred by shellfire. As 1916 stumbled to its bitter end, yielding nothing but more craters and casualty lists, a profound, almost existential weariness settled over Europe. It felt like the world had signed a permanent lease on misery, and the rent was paid in blood. Everyone, from the mud-caked private to the starched general, knew that something had to give. The war machine, however, had merely adapted, growing more cunning, more insidious. And so, 1917 dawns, not with the optimism of 1914, nor even the desperate hope of 1915, but with a grim resolve that borders on exhaustion. Both sides still believed they could win, but the path to victory was becoming less about grand maneuvers and more about an endless, brutal game of chicken. Who would run out of men, morale, or munitions first? For Germany, facing the strangling grip of the British naval blockade, remember that less dramatic, but utterly vital, form of warfare? The answer seemed to lie beneath the waves. The British had sealed off the North Sea like a giant, invisible cork, slowly starving the German economy. Food was scarce, raw materials dwindled. It was getting desperate. So, in January 1917, Kaiser Wilhelm II made a momentous, incredibly risky decision. Germany would resume unrestricted submarine warfare. This meant U-boats would sink any ship, military or civilian, neutral or belligerent, heading for Allied ports without warning. You can almost feel the cold, clammy fear in the ships of the Atlantic. Merchant sailors, bringing vital supplies across the ocean, knew their lives now hung by a thread, constantly scanning the waves for a periscope or the telltale wake of a torpedo. Imagine being stuck on a cramped cargo ship, weeks away from land, knowing an unseen predator could send you to the bottom in minutes. It was a terrifying gamble for Germany, a roll of the dice with global consequences. They knew it would almost certainly bring the United States into the war, but they calculated that they could starve Britain into submission before American troops could even arrive in Europe in significant numbers. It was a high-stakes poker game, and the chips were human lives. And they were right about one thing. It did bring the United States into the war. America, remember, had largely been sitting on the sidelines, trying to uphold its neutrality, a position that's always easier to maintain when you're an ocean away. President Woodrow Wilson had won re-election on the slogan, "He kept us out of war." But German U-boats, like particularly persistent mosquitoes, kept buzzing. The sinking of the Lusitania, way back in 1915, had been a sharp poke. But the final, infuriating jab came in the form of a secret message, intercepted and decoded by British intelligence, a little tidbit called the Zimmermann telegram. This coded message, sent by German Foreign Secretary Arthur Zimmermann to the German ambassador in Mexico, proposed a military alliance between Germany and Mexico if the U.S. entered the war. In exchange for Mexico declaring war on the U.S., Germany promised to help Mexico reclaim lost territories in Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. Now, imagine that landing on the front page of a newspaper today. Outrage. And it was then too. This wasn't just about sinking ships. This was about a direct threat to American soil. Coupled with the relentless sinkings in the Atlantic, it was the final straw. On April 6, 1917, America declared war on Germany. You might think, finally, the cavalry has arrived, and they were coming, eventually. But the U.S. wasn't quite ready for a European-style war. Their army was tiny by European standards, an almost quaint force compared to the millions already locked in the trenches. They needed to raise, train, and equip millions of men, then somehow transport them across a U-boat-infested ocean. It would take time, precious, agonizing time. For the French and British, weary and bled white, the sight of a fresh, limitless supply of manpower on the horizon was like a mirage in the desert, desperately hoped for, but still tantalizingly out of reach. For now, the war machine would have to keep grinding on. Without them, speaking of grinding, while the Western Front remained stubbornly static, a colossal, game-changing shift was occurring far to the east. In the sprawling, creaking Russian Empire, remembers our Nicholas II clinging to his autocratic past? Well, his past was about to catch up to him. Years of military defeats, staggering casualties, Russia's losses were truly immense. Arguably the highest of any combatant, economic mismanagement, and widespread hunger had finally pushed the Russian people past their breaking point. In February 1917, that's March in the Western calendar, because Russia was still using the old Julian calendar, a quaint historical detail that always makes historians sigh. The simmering discontent boiled over. Bread riots erupted in Petrograd, modern-day St. Petersburg. Soldiers, fed up with the war and ordered to suppress the protests, instead joined them. The army fractured, the police vanished. Within days, Tsar Nicholas II, isolated and without support, was forced to abdicate. It was the end of 3 centuries of Romanov rule. You watch as an ancient dynasty crumbles, seemingly overnight, replaced by a provisional government that tried to keep Russia in the war. But the provisional government, trying to balance popular demands for peace with their commitment to the Allies, was playing a losing hand. The soldiers, sick of dying, were deserting in droves. Peasants, hungry for land, were seizing estates. Workers, tired of empty promises, were forming their own councils or Soviets. Chaos reigned. Then, in October 1917, November by Western reckoning, a radical political faction, the Bolsheviks, led by the shrewd and utterly ruthless Vladimir Lenin, seized power in a coup. Their slogan, peace, land, and bread, and they meant the peace part. The war machine had just lost an entire front. With the Bolsheviks now in charge, Russia began negotiations with Germany, leading to the incredibly harsh Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in early 1918, which pulled Russia completely out of the war. Imagine the sigh of relief on the German side. Suddenly, millions of German troops, who had been tied up on the Eastern Front for over 3 years, were free to be transferred west, strengthening their lines and preparing for a final, desperate push. This was not a minor shift. This was a fundamental rebalancing of power, a shot of adrenaline to the Central Powers, giving them a real, if fleeting, chance at victory. For the Allies, already exhausted, it was a gut punch. The loss of Russia was felt immediately and profoundly on the Western Front, particularly by the French. They had borne the brunt of the German attacks for years, especially at Verdun, and their army was utterly exhausted. Morale was hanging by a thread. But still, the High Command insisted on another big push. This time, it was the turn of General Robert Nivelle, the new French commander. Nivelle was a charismatic figure, a believer in the power of artillery and a swift, decisive breakthrough. His plan, to be launched on the Chemin-des-Dames Ridge in April 1917, was an ambitious, deeply flawed attempt at a shock assault. He promised a rapid victory, a clean break. "We have the method," he declared. "The enemy will not escape." You stand there, listening to the promises, and a cold dread settles in. You've heard this song before. The preliminary bombardment for Nivelle's offensive was less prolonged than the Somme, but just as intense in its way. Then, the attack. It was supposed to be a surprise, a swift, overwhelming assault. But the Germans, forewarned by captured documents and aerial reconnaissance, had anticipated the attack and withdrawn to prepared, deeper defensive lines. The French infantry advanced into a hurricane of machine gun fire and artillery, straight into a well-prepared trap. The ground was treacherous, the enemy positions well hidden. Casualties mounted at a horrific rate. The promised breakthrough never came. Instead, it was another bloody, futile grind, another Verdun or Somme, but condensed into a few agonizing days and weeks. The French army, pushed beyond endurance, finally began to crack, not with a full-blown revolution like Russia, but with something arguably more terrifying for the commanders: widespread mutinies. You hear the whispers, then the open refusal. Men, having seen too many friends die for a few yards of mud, simply refused to go over the top. They would defend their trenches, yes, fiercely, but they wouldn't launch suicidal attacks anymore. Imagine the scene: officers ordering a charge, and companies of men just sitting down. They weren't cowards. They were brave men who had simply had enough of being treated like cannon fodder. They wanted better food, more rest, fairer rotations, and an end to these pointless, suicidal offensives. They wanted their lives to matter more than a general's ego. The mutinies spread rapidly, affecting dozens of divisions, infecting hundreds of thousands of men. For a terrifying period, the French army was on the verge of collapse. Historians still debate just how close it came, but suffice it to say, it was a truly existential crisis. General Nivelle was sacked, replaced by the grimly competent General Philippe Pétain, the hero of Verdun. Pétain understood. He didn't punish the mutineers indiscriminately. Instead, he listened. He implemented a more humane system, improved rations, ensured proper rest, and, crucially, limited offensive operations to bite and hold tactics, small-scale attacks with limited objectives, designed to wear down the enemy rather than achieve a grand breakthrough. Slowly, painfully, Pétain restored the French army's morale. But the cost was profound. The French were out of the game for major offensives for the rest of 1917. The baton of Big Push now passed squarely to the British, and the British, under Field Marshal Haig, were more than ready to pick it up. With the French recovering from their breakdown, Haig turned his attention to Flanders, specifically the area around Ypres, which had already seen to brutal battles. This would become known as the Third Battle of Ypres, or, more infamously, Passchendaele. Haig's objectives were ambitious: capture the ridge of Passchendaele, push on to seize German U-boat bases on the Belgian coast, and perhaps finally break the German line. It sounded good on paper, but Flanders, oh, Flanders. If Verdun was a meat grinder, and the Somme was a mud bath, Passchendaele was a hellish, drowning quagmire. The ground around Ypres is notoriously low-lying, often below sea level, drained by a network of ditches and canals. To prepare for the offensive, the British launched another colossal artillery bombardment, firing millions upon millions of shells for weeks. The shelling, intended to pulverize German defenses, also pulverized the delicate drainage systems of Flanders. Then, on July 31st, 1917, just as the infantry attack began, the heavens opened, and they did not close for weeks. You are there, in the pouring rain, watching the landscape dissolve into a sea of viscous, sucking mud. Shell craters, already vast and numerous, fill with water, becoming lethal traps. Horses and mules, weighed down by supplies, sink and drown. Men, exhausted and encumbered by their heavy equipment, slip and fall, sometimes disappearing into the depths. The mud is everywhere, It clogs rifles, sticks to uniforms, sucks at your boots with every agonizing step. It swallows the wounded, turns the unburied dead into grotesque, half-submerged statues. Imagine trudging through waist-deep, churning chocolate pudding. But the pudding is also filled with barbed wire, shattered timber, and the unseen remains of thousands of men. The smell of decay, mixed with the acrid scent of gas and cadite, is overwhelming. The Germans, once again, were dug in deep on the ridges, their machine guns well positioned, firing into the struggling, exposed infantry. Every yard gained was bought at an unimaginable cost. Artillery shells, landing in the mud, often failed to explode, but their concussive force could still turn the soft ground into a geyser of mud and human remains. The battlefield was a landscape from a nightmare, utterly devoid of any natural features, just a churned, pockmarked desolation. Communications broke down constantly. Orders were delayed. Supplies couldn't get through. Casualties were evacuated by men slipping and stumbling on duck boards laid over the mud, constantly under shell fire. The battle dragged on, month after agonizing month, through August, September, October, and into November. Each small advance, each few hundred yards, was a victory only in the most abstract, statistical sense. The sheer physical and psychological toll was immense. Men were not just fighting the enemy, they were fighting the mud, the rain, the cold, the constant fear of drowning in a shell hole. Shell shock cases soared. Soldiers were reduced to trembling wrecks, their minds unable to cope with the incessant noise and horror. By the time the Canadian Corps finally captured the village of Passchendaele on November 6th, the battle was effectively over, ground to a halt by exhaustion and the relentless Flanders winter. The Allied advance had been a paltry 5 miles. The casualties were horrific, and estimated to 150,000 British and Dominion casualties, and around 0 to 400,000 German casualties. Like the Somme, it remains a battle of intense historical debate. Was it necessary? Did it achieve anything beyond wearing down both sides? Haig maintained it was vital to keep pressure on the Germans and wear them out. Critics argued it was a pointless slaughter, a testament to obstinate leadership and a failure to adapt to the conditions. For the men who fought there, it was simply Passchendaele, a byword for mud, misery, and unimaginable suffering. But even in this year of desperate attrition, the war machine was still innovating, however slowly. Gas attacks were becoming more sophisticated, with new types like mustard gas, which caused agonizing burns and blisters, adding another layer of terror. Gas masks, thankfully, were also improving, becoming more effective, though still claustrophobic and uncomfortable. Aircraft were no longer just for observation. They were increasingly used for ground attack, bombing, and strafing enemy positions, becoming more robust and faster. And those experimental tanks from the Somme? They were getting better, more reliable, more numerous. In November 1917, at the Battle of Cambrai, the British launched a surprise attack using hundreds of tanks en masse, without a preliminary bombardment. It achieved initial shock and deep penetrations, demonstrating the potential of this new weapon. But logistics failed to keep up, and German counterattacks quickly nullified most gains. Still, it was a glimpse into the future of warfare, a hint of what armored vehicles could do. As 1917 finally mercifully came to a close, a weary silence, punctuated by distant shellfire, settled over the Western Front. It had been a year of immense, shattering changes. Russia out, America in but not yet fully arrived. The French army, battered but slowly recovering. The British army, bearing the brunt of the fighting and suffering immense losses at Passchendaele. The war machine, however, indifferent to human suffering or grand strategy, simply chewed on, adapting its methods, finding new ways to consume. It had bled Europe white, but it was far from finished. With Russia out, the Germans now had a window, a chance for one last, desperate throw of the dice, to win the war before the fresh American millions arrived. The stakes had never been higher. The exhausted, shell-shocked veterans on both sides knew that 1918 would be the year the stalemate would finally break, one way or another. The year of the last, colossal gamble. And you, down in the mud, you just try to breathe, to stay warm, to find a sliver of hope in the suffocating darkness, knowing that the machine is already revving its engines for its final, terrifying act. But that, my friend, is a story for when the first light of dawn begins to paint the sky, promising either a new day or perhaps the end of all days. And the first light of dawn begins to paint the sky, promising either a new day or perhaps the end of all days. It's January 1918, and a chill, electric tension hangs over the Western Front. Everyone knows it. The Germans, with Russia finally out of the war, have moved their seasoned divisions. Their stormtroopers, specially trained, highly mobile infiltration units from the east. They've got one last, desperate throw of the dice. A massive offensive designed to punch through the Allied lines and win the war, before the lumbering giant of America can truly arrive. This isn't about attrition anymore. Not exactly. This is a gamble, a desperate, all-or-nothing blitz. General Erich Ludendorff, the effective commander of the German army, has planned it meticulously, Operation Michael, followed by a series of subsequent offensives. The goal? To split the British and French armies, push the British back to the coast, and defeat them, before turning on the French. And you, down in the muddy, perpetually damp trenches, can feel the storm brewing. It's a different kind of quiet, a pregnant stillness before the thunder. On March 21st, 1918, at 4:40 a.m., the storm breaks. It's foggy, dense, and cold. Then, the world erupts. Over 6,000 German artillery pieces open fire simultaneously along a 50-mile front. This isn't like the Somme. This isn't a prolonged, weeks-long pulverization. This is a rapid, incredibly intense hurricane bombardment, designed to suppress, to disorient, to shatter morale, then to lift and allow the stormtroopers to pour through. You hear the shells whizzing overhead, a continuous, deafening shriek, followed by earth-shattering explosions that vibrate through your very bones. Gas shells, high explosive, shrapnel, a terrifying symphony of destruction. When the barrage lifts, the German stormtroopers, small groups of highly trained infantry, emerge from the fog. They're not marching in lines. They're bypassing strong points, infiltrating weak spots, moving fast, carrying light machine guns. grenades, and flamethrowers. This is new. This is terrifyingly effective. The British lines, spread thin, reeling from the bombardment, are simply overwhelmed. Panic sets in. Communications fail. Entire divisions are bypassed, cut off, or forced into headlong retreats. You are caught in the swirling chaos. The speed of the German advance is unlike anything seen on the Western Front since 1914. They gain miles, not yards, in a single day. Paris, again, seems threatened. The big German Paris gun are truly massive. Long-range artillery piece begins shelling the French capital from 75 miles away. A psychological terror weapon designed to break civilian morale. Imagine sitting in Paris, far from the front, and suddenly a giant shell lands. Seemingly out of nowhere, an arbitrary act of violence. It's an eerie reminder of how close the war machine has come to your doorstep. The Germans push hard, but their own success begins to turn against them. Their supply lines, still reliant on horse-drawn transport, can't keep up with the speed of their advance. Their stormtroopers, pushed to the limits of human endurance, outrun their heavy artillery and fresh supplies. They capture vast quantities of Allied stores, but they're too exhausted, too disorganized, to properly exploit them. You see German soldiers, gaunt from years of rationing, gorging themselves on captured British food, or pausing to pillage supplies, losing precious time. The initial momentum begins to falter, not from enemy resistance so much as from its own logistical limits and sheer exhaustion. The British and French, though reeling, desperately try to stem the tide. They rush reserves to the breaking points, and then you see them, small numbers at first, but steadily growing. The Americans, the doughboys, they're fresh, often green, sometimes comically awkward in their new uniforms, and utterly, wonderfully naive about the horrors of trench warfare. They arrive singing, full of optimism, often still talking about getting the Hun. You, the hardened veteran, eye them with a mixture of pity, admiration, and a faint, almost forgotten, flicker of hope. They don't know the rules of this game yet. They charge machine guns head-on, sometimes with tragic results. But they bring an almost boundless energy, a raw, aggressive determination, and, crucially, an absolutely limitless supply of manpower. It's a psychological blow to the Germans, who had banked on winning before America could become a factor. Every fresh American face is a reminder that Germany is bleeding dry, while the Allies are just getting started. The German spring offensives, Michael, Georgette, Blücherjoch, Gneisenau, Mannheims, grind to a halt by July. They've advanced deep into Allied territory, but they haven't achieved their strategic objective. They haven't split the British and French, and they haven't won the war. They've paid a terrible price. Hundreds of thousands of their best men, their stormtroopers, are gone, irreplaceable. Their morale is cracking. They have nothing left in the tank. The war machine, having gorged itself on its last grand feast, is now sputtering. And then, it's the Allies' turn. Now that the German offensive has exhausted itself, the Allied High Command, newly united under the overall command of French General Ferdinand and Foch, sees their chance. They've learned lessons, bitter, bloody lessons. They have the American manpower starting to flow, and crucially, They've perfected their all-arms approach. This isn't just infantry charges or massive bombardments anymore. This is coordinated warfare, infantry, tanks, artillery, and aircraft, all working together in a symphony of destruction. The new approach is unleashed on August 8, 1918. You are part of the offensive near Amiens. The morning is foggy, once again, but this time it's the Allies attacking. There's no long, preliminary bombardment to warn the Germans. Instead, a short, sharp, terrifying hurricane of shells falls, precisely targeted, followed immediately by waves of tanks, hundreds of them, rumbling out of the mist, crushing barbed wire, flattening machine gun nests. You follow behind them, an infantryman, seeing paths cleared, the enemy disoriented and terrified. The effect is devastating. The German lines shatter. Ludendorff himself calls August 8th the Black Day of the German army. It's not just a tactical defeat, it's a psychological one. German soldiers, who had just been on the offensive, are now surrendering in droves, often without a fight. They've had enough. They're exhausted, starving, disheartened. They see the endless waves of fresh American, British, and French troops, the continuous rumble of new tanks, the drone of Allied aircraft dominating the skies, and they know the game is up. From this point, there is no stopping the Allied advance. What follows is known as the 100 Days Offensive, a relentless, grinding push that lasts from August to November. You are moving forward, sometimes for miles in a single day, something unimaginable just months ago. You see towns and villages that have been under German occupation for years, now liberated. Their inhabitants emerging, bewildered but hopeful. The destruction is still immense, the landscape still scarred. But there's a sense of purpose now, a momentum. The war machine is now devouring the Germans. Their counterattacks are weak, their morale shattered. They are retreating, fighting desperate rearguard actions. But they are retreating. The fighting is still brutal, still deadly. There are still moments of paralyzing fear, still comrades falling. But the tide has turned decisively. You capture more prisoners, more guns, more territory. The German army, once the epitome of efficiency, is cracking under the strain. And the collapse isn't just happening on the Western Front. The war machine is taking down its other victims too. In September, Bulgaria, exhausted and starving, signs an armistice. In October, the vast, ancient Ottoman Empire, battered by campaigns in Mesopotamia and Palestine, where Lawrence of Arabia and General Allenby's forces had scored significant victories, finally collapses and signs its own armistice. Then, in late October and early November, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, that old, overstuffed armchair of an empire, simply disintegrates. Its various ethnic groups, tired of fighting for a dying dynasty, declare independence. The empire splits apart along its seams, a mosaic shattering into a dozen smaller pieces. Germany stands alone, its allies gone, its army in retreat, its people starving from the relentless Allied blockade. At home, unrest is boiling over. Sailors at Kiel mutiny rather than embark on a suicidal last-ditch naval battle. Workers strike. Revolution is in the air. On November 9th, Kaiser Wilhelm II, the proud embodiment of Imperial Germany, is forced to abdicate and flees to the Netherlands. A new German republic is declared. And then, on November 11th, 1918, at 11 a.m., it happens. The guns fall silent. You are there. One moment, the air is filled with the familiar, terrifying symphony of explosions, the incessant crackle of machine guns, the screams of the wounded. The next, a profound, eerie, almost unbelievable silence descends. It's like the world has suddenly held its breath. You listen, straining your ears, convinced it's a trick, a lull before another barrage. But no, the silence holds. The constant, thrumming heartbeat of the war, that low, metallic growl of the war machine, has stopped. Men emerge from their dugouts, cautiously at first, then with a bewildered disbelief. Some cheer, some weep openly. Many just stand there, numb, unable to comprehend that it's truly over. The fighting, the suffering, the relentless grind that has defined their existence for over 4 years has ceased. You look around at the devastated landscape, the shell craters, the twisted barbed wire, the skeletal trees, and you feel nothing and everything. Relief, yes, a wave of it so powerful it almost knocks you over, but also a profound emptiness. A sense of loss for all the friends who didn't make it to this moment. The joy is mixed with an immense, incalculable grief. It's not a celebration of victory for many. It's simply the cessation of a nightmare. The machine, after devouring over 16 million lives, after chewing through generations, after reshaping continents and societies, has finally run out of fuel. Its gears are still, its hungry maw finally closed, for now. You watch as soldiers, once mortal enemies, cautiously emerge from their respective trenches. Some shaking hands, some just staring at each other across the devastated no man's land. Two sides of the same coin of suffering. But the high commands quickly put an end to such fraternization. The war might be over, but the divisions, the hatreds, the bitter memories would linger. And the shape of the future, the very peace itself, would be forged in the crucible of victory and defeat, in the halls of power, not in the muddy, silent fields of Flanders or the Somme. The world had survived, but it was irrevocably, fundamentally changed. The quaint optimism of 1914 was dead, buried under millions of tons of mud and steel. A new, cynical, weary world was being born, and the consequences, the long, long shadow of this conflict, would stretch out for decades, shaping events, creating new conflicts, and setting the stage for even greater horrors to come. But those, my friend, the lingering effects, the fragile peace, and the seeds of the next great global catastrophe, that is a story for when the darkness deepens and the long, terrible lessons of history begin to unfold. And the darkness deepens and the long, terrible lessons of history begin to unfold. You stand there, in the sudden, ringing silence of November 11th, 1918, 11 a.m. The machine has stopped. Its gears are locked, its boilers cool, but the echoes of its grinding, the vibrations in the earth, the phantom cries, they will haunt this landscape and the men who fought on it for generations. The initial disbelief slowly gives way to a kind of stunned relief. Some men cheer, half-heartedly, their voices hoarse, their lungs unused to such simple exertion after years of gasping in polluted air. Others just stare at their boots or at the faces of their comrades. The lines of exhaustion etched deep, the 1,000-yard stare a permanent fixture in their eyes. You see a flicker of something in them, a fragile hope, a desperate exhaustion, and a profound, unutterable sadness for the millions who never made it to this silence. They just aren't there anymore. They're mud and bone and forgotten names on overgrown memorials. Getting home, for many, is almost as disorienting as going to war. You queue for trains, packed tight with men who were once brothers in arms, now just strangers heading for disparate futures. The journey takes you through shattered towns, past bombed-out factories, and across landscapes where every tree is a splintered stump, every field a cratered moonscape. The civilian world, the one you fought for, seems utterly alien. People look at you with a mix of reverence and pity. They offer you kindness, but you sense they can't truly understand. How could they? They haven't seen the things you've seen, smelled the things you've smelled, done the things you've done. Many of your comrades, those who are left, carry invisible wounds. The shell shock that doctors once dismissed as cowardice is now becoming understood as a real, debilitating trauma, a mind shattered by ceaseless noise and horror. You see men who jump at sudden sounds, who stare blankly into space, who can't sleep, or who are tormented by nightmares. They're called the Lost Generation, not just because so many died, but because those who survived were fundamentally altered. A bridge between a naive past and a brutal present, often struggling to find their place in a world that refused to acknowledge their scars. They had left as boys, full of ideals, and returned as haunted, cynical men. The war machine had chewed up their innocence and spat it out. But even as the guns fell silent, the political battles were just beginning. The victorious powers gathered in Paris in January 1919 for the Peace Conference, a grand affair designed to redraw the map of Europe and settle the score. Imagine the scene. Hundreds of delegates from 30 to allied nations, all jostling for influence, all with their own agendas, their own grievances, their own demands. It was like a particularly tense, global family reunion, where everyone blames everyone else for the broken vase. At the heart of it were the Big Four, the titans who would shape the peace. There was Woodrow Wilson, the American president, a stern, idealistic former academic, who arrived with his 14 points, a vision for a just and lasting peace based on self-determination, open diplomacy, and, most importantly, a League of Nations, a global organization to prevent future wars. He was like the earnest headmaster, convinced that if everyone just followed the rules, everything would be fine. Then there was Georges Clemenceau, the Tiger of France, an old, formidable statesman, whose country had suffered the most on the Western Front. His demands were simple: security for France and vengeance against Germany. He wanted to ensure Germany could never threaten France again. He eyed Wilson's idealism with cynical amusement, famously quipping that even God only had 10 commandments. For Clemenceau, this wasn't about abstract ideals. It was about ensuring that French blood, poured out over for brutal years, had not been shed in vain. David Lloyd George, the shrewd, pragmatic Prime Minister of Great Britain, was caught in the middle. He wanted a stable Europe for trade, But he also had to answer to a British public baying for German blood, demanding that Germany pay for the war. He tried to mediate between Wilson's idealism and Clemenceau's demands for retribution, walking a tightrope between reconciliation and punishment. He knew, deep down, that a peace that was too harsh would only breed resentment. But he also knew his political survival depended on being seen as tough on Germany. Finally, there was Vittorio Orlando, the Prime Minister of Italy, whose main concern was securing the territorial gains Italy had been promised. For joining the Allied side, though he often found himself sidelined by the other three, it was a clash of titans, of competing national interests, of deeply held convictions and festering resentments. Conspicuously absent from these discussions were the vanquished. Germany was not invited to negotiate. They were simply presented with the terms. Russia, now under Bolshevik rule, was also excluded, viewed with suspicion and fear by the Western powers. Imagine being told the fate of your nation, your very existence, would be decided asterisk for asterisk you. In a room you weren't allowed to enter. It bred a deep, simmering sense of injustice and humiliation. The resulting document signed in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles on June 28, 1919, exactly 5 years after the assassination in Sarajevo. That sparked the whole thing, was a compromise, and like most compromises, it pleased almost no one. It was called the Treaty of Versailles, and it would cast a long, dark shadow over the next decades. You read its terms, and you feel the weight of its intent. Article 231, the infamous War Guilt Clause, declared Germany and its allies solely responsible for causing the war. This wasn't just a legal statement, it was a moral condemnation, a public shaming that Germans felt deeply unjust and humiliating. Historians still argue about the true origins of the war, a complex tangle of factors. But Germany was forced to bear the full burden of blame. Then came the reparations. Germany was to pay enormous sums of money to the Allied powers, ostensibly to cover the cost of the war and damages. The final figure, said later, was a staggering 130 billion gold marks, a sum so vast it seemed designed to cripple Germany's economy for generations. Imagine being handed a bill for something that bankrupts you entirely, especially when you feel you're not solely to blame. Territorially, Germany was stripped bare. Alsace-Lorraine was returned to France, of course. The Rhineland, Germany's industrial heartland, was demilitarized, meaning no German troops or fortifications were allowed there, a constant vulnerability. The Saar region, rich in coal, was placed under League of Nations control for 15 years. Its output going to France. Parts of eastern Germany were ceded to a newly recreated Poland, creating the Polish Corridor, a strip of land that separated East Prussia from the rest of Germany, and would become a source of intense nationalist resentment. All German overseas colonies were seized and turned into mandates under the control of Allied powers, effectively dividing up the spoils of empire, and its military was crippled. The German army was limited to a mere 100,000 men, no tanks, no heavy artillery, no air force, and a tiny navy. It was designed to ensure Germany could never again launch an aggressive war. But for many Germans, it felt like an emasculation, an insult to their national pride. You can almost hear the outcry, the bitterness, the sense of betrayal that swept through Germany. They felt they had agreed to an armistice based on Wilson's idealistic 14 points, only to be hit with a dictated peace, asterisk dictat asterisk. This resentment, this feeling of being unfairly treated and humiliated, would fester and grow, feeding extremist ideologies and laying the groundwork for future conflict. Historians universally agree that while the Treaty of Versailles achieved many short-term aims, of the victorious powers its punitive nature, particularly the war guilt and reparations clauses, contributed significantly to the instability that would lead to another even more terrible war. It was peace, but a deeply flawed, fragile peace. The map of Europe was indeed redrawn. The vast, multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian Empire, that old, overstuffed armchair, was shattered into several new, independent states: Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, and parts of Poland, Romania, Yugoslavia, and Italy. You see the birth of new nations, new borders, but also new minorities, new grievances, new flashpoints. The Ottoman Empire, too, was broken up, its vast Middle Eastern territories carved into mandates, thinly disguised colonial possessions, mostly under British and French control, setting the stage for decades of instability and conflict you still witness today. The very lines drawn in the sand by European diplomats, like the infamous Sykes-Picot Agreement, ignored the complexities of local populations and sown the seeds of deep, lasting resentment. And Wilson's dream, the League of Nations? It was created, a grand experiment in international cooperation, a place where nations could talk, negotiate, and hopefully avoid future wars. You imagine the hopeful faces, the grand pronouncements, but the irony is bitter. The United States, its chief architect, ultimately refused to join. The American Senate, wary of entangling alliances and fearing a loss of sovereignty, rejected the treaty. Without the full participation of a major world power like the U.S., the League was hobbled from the start, a potentially powerful idea with too little actual power or commitment to enforce its will. It could condemn aggression, but it lacked the teeth to truly stop it. It was a good idea, perhaps, but born too soon, or into a world too cynical. The economic consequences were profound. Germany, struggling under the weight of reparations, plunged into hyperinflation in the early 1920s, its currency becoming worthless. Imagine needing a wheelbarrow full of banknotes to buy a loaf of bread. Savings were wiped out, the middle class decimated, trust in institutions eroded. This economic chaos, combined with the humiliation of Versailles, created fertile ground for radical political movements promising simple, brutal solutions. Culturally, the world was shaken to its core. The optimism, the belief in progress, the old certainties of the 19th century were utterly shattered. A profound disillusionment settled over society. Art, literature, and philosophy reflected this new cynicism, this sense of a world broken beyond repair. Women, who had stepped into factories and farms to keep nations running during the war, had proven their capabilities, forever altering social norms and pushing for greater rights, even if progress was slow and hard-won. The war had accelerated technological change, but it had also shown its terrifying, destructive potential. And so, the long shadow of the Great War stretched out across the 1920s and into the 1930s. The unresolved grievances, the bitter resentments, the economic instability, the failure of collective security, the rise of aggressive, totalitarian regimes, all these seeds, sown during the war and at the peace conference, began to sprout. The war machine, you realize, hadn't truly been dismantled. It had merely gone dormant, its gears waiting to be re-engaged, its insatiable hunger temporarily sated, but far from gone. The lessons of Verdun, Gallipoli, and the Somme, the lessons of industrial slaughter and attritional madness, were not truly learned by all. Some saw the war as a mistake to be avoided, others a challenge to be overcome, a failure to be avenged. And it was this lingering spirit, this unaddressed wound, that would ultimately lead, just 2 decades later, to the next, even more devastating global conflict. The very peace that was supposed to end all wars had, tragically, merely set the stage for the next one. The world, battered and weary, stumbled out of the First World War, only to walk directly into the path of the Second. But tonight, my friend, the long journey through the history of the Great War is complete. The distant echoes of the guns are finally fading. The image of the mud, the barbed wire, the endless skies, the faces of those young men. It all softens now, blurring at the edges. You can almost feel the cool, gentle air of your own room, the quiet hum of your fan, the soft glow of a nightlight, the familiar comfort of your bed. The ghosts of the past, the memories of Verdun and Gallipoli, the chilling logic of the war machine. They are retreating now, back into the pages of history, back into the quiet corners of your mind. There's nothing left to do but close your eyes, drift deeper into the stillness, and let the quietness of your own time envelop you. The world has moved on, far from those terrible fields, and you are safe here, now, in your own peaceful space. The machine is quiet. Sleep comes.